Colorado Territory, 1870. Frost Vance had long since decided that the frontier was no place for love. His first 24 years had taught him that much. Out here, a man's only true companions were his horse, his rifle, and the constant specter of death that loomed over every mountain pass. Love was a luxury that belonged to civilized places with church steeples and white picket fences, not to men who made their living driving cattle through unforgiving terrain, sleeping under stars that offered no comfort. The early spring wind bit through his canvas jacket as he guided his buckskin gelding down the winding trail toward the small settlement of Credence. His supplies had run dangerously low after 3 months working as a ranch hand up in the high country. Now, with a small pouch of hard-earned dollars and a desperate need for grain, coffee, and ammunition, Frost found himself reluctantly heading toward civilization. "Just a day in town, that's all," he muttered to his horse. "Get what we need and head back to the mountains where we belong." His horse nickered in what Frost took to be agreement. Animals made sense to him. They wanted simple things like food and shelter. People wanted complications. People wanted your heart and soul, and Frost had seen too many good men lose themselves to such foolishness. His own father had died of a broken heart after his mother had succumbed to mountain fever. Frost wouldn't make the same mistake. The wilderness was cruel enough without adding the pain that came from loving someone you couldn't protect. As Credence came into view, Frost noted the changes since his last visit months before. New buildings had sprung up, including what appeared to be a proper general store replacing the previous cramped trading post. The town was growing, like so many others as the railroad pushed ever westward. Progress, they called it. Frost called it the slow death of everything he understood. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, the small bell above the door announcing his arrival. The interior was unexpectedly orderly, with shelves neatly stocked with canned goods, tools, and sundries. The scent of coffee and leather mingled pleasantly. "Be right with you," called a feminine voice from the back room. Frost removed his hat, revealing sandy blonde hair that hadn't seen proper trimming in months. He ran a hand along his light stubble, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. When she emerged from the back room, Frost found himself momentarily speechless. She was young, no more than 22 by his estimation, with honey blonde hair pulled into a practical but becoming style. Her blue dress was modest but well-fitted, and though simple, it was clearly chosen with care. What struck him most, however, were her eyes, green as summer grass, but with a hardness to them that seemed at odds with her youth. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice strong and clear. Frost cleared his throat. "Need grain for my horse. Coffee and ammunition, too, if you have it." "We do," she replied, moving behind the counter. "Just opened last month. I'm Pearl Wilson, Frost Vance," he offered, surprising himself with the disclosure. Normally, he gave as little information as possible in town. "Well, Mr. Vance, you're in luck. Got a fresh shipment of grain yesterday. How much will you be needing?" As she measured out his order, Frost noticed the wedding band on her finger, and then, more tellingly, the black ribbon pinned to her dress, the mark of recent widowhood. Something in his chest tightened. She was too young to be a widow. "You own this place?" he asked. A shadow crossed her face. "I do now. My husband built it. He passed 6 weeks ago, mining accident up at the Silver Creek operation." "I'm sorry," Frost said, the words feeling inadequate. Pearl's chin lifted slightly. "Thank you. That'll be $1.60 for everything." Frost counted out the money, noticing the slight trembling in her hands as she wrapped his purchases. Despite her composed demeanor, grief was clearly a close companion. "Will you be staying in town long?" she asked, her tone professionally polite as she handed him his parcel. "No, ma'am. Just passing through." She nodded. "Safe travels then, Mr. Vance." Frost stepped back into the spring sunshine, feeling oddly unsettled. He secured his supplies to his saddle, preparing to leave town as quickly as he'd arrived. But as he mounted his horse, a commotion at the far end of the street caught his attention. 3 men on horseback were riding hard into town, whooping and firing revolvers into the air. The few people on the street scattered, ducking into buildings. Frost recognized trouble when he saw it. These men were either drunk or looking to cause havoc, possibly both. His instinct was to ride in the opposite direction. Whatever was about to happen wasn't his concern. He'd learned long ago that a man lived longer by minding his own business. But then he heard glass shatter. Turning in his saddle, he saw that one of the riders had thrown something through the window of the general store, Pearl Wilson's store. Before he could reconsider, Frost was dismounting and reaching for the rifle strapped to his saddle. Some decisions, he would later reflect, aren't really decisions at all, but reactions that reveal more about a man than all his careful planning. The sound of a woman's scream cemented his course. In that moment, riding away wasn't an option, no matter how much sense it might have made. And in that split-second choice, the trajectory of Frost Vance's carefully isolated life veered irrevocably off course. Inside the store, Pearl had dropped behind the counter at the first sound of breaking glass. Her heart hammered in her chest as heavy boots stomped across the wooden floor, crunching on shattered glass. "Where are you, Wilson widow?" a gruff voice called out. "Time to pay your husband's debts." Pearl's blood ran cold. Thomas had mentioned gambling debts before he died, but she believed they were settled. Evidently, she was wrong. "I don't know what you're talking about," she called back, reaching under the counter for the small revolver Thomas had insisted she keep there. "Your husband owed Harlan Delaney $300, another voice explained. "And with interest, that's now $500. Delaney's been patient, waiting for the insurance money we know you collected." Pearl gripped the revolver tighter. There had been no insurance money, just a half-built store and a mountain of supplier debts that she'd been working night and day to pay off. "Thomas never mentioned any debt to Delaney," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Laughter followed her statement. "Well, men don't tell their pretty wives everything, do they? Now come on out, and we'll discuss payment terms." The implication in his tone made Pearl's skin crawl. She was about to respond when the bell above the door rang again. Through a gap in the counter, she could see a pair of worn boots step inside. "Gentlemen," came a calm voice that Pearl recognized as belonging to Frost Vance. "I think you've made a mistake. This ain't your business, stranger," one of the men growled. "I'm making it my business," Frost replied. "The lady says there's no debt, so I suggest you take your grievance elsewhere." Pearl held her breath, the small revolver steady in her hand now. She couldn't see what was happening, but the tension in the room was palpable. "3 against 1, mister. Those ain't good odds." "I'm not much for gambling," Frost said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "But I'd wager I can put a bullet in at least 2 of you before you clear leather. Now, who wants to test that theory?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. "We'll be back," one of the men finally said. "And Delaney will come himself next time. Tell the widow that." "I'll be sure to pass along the message," Frost answered. "Now get." The sound of retreating boots was followed by the door closing. Pearl slowly rose from behind the counter, the revolver still clutched in her trembling hand. Frost stood by the door, his rifle held casually but ready. His eyes, blue as a winter sky, met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You all right, Mrs. Wilson?" Pearl nodded, carefully setting the revolver on the counter. "Yes, thanks to you. Though I fear you've just made some dangerous enemies on my behalf." Frost's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Wouldn't be the first time. As Pearl surveyed the damage to her store, broken glass, merchandise strewn across the floor, she felt despair welling up inside her. Just when she'd begun to believe she might make this business work, this happened. "Who's Harlan Delaney?" Frost asked, interrupting her thoughts as he helped her pick up scattered tins. "A businessman from Denver, or so I've heard. He owns mining interests and a gambling house in Boulder." Pearl sighed, brushing glass from a shelf. "Thomas never mentioned owing him money." "Men keep secrets," Frost observed, then seemed to regret his bluntness. "Sorry, ma'am. No need for apologies." "You're right." Pearl picked up a broom and began sweeping glass. "The question is, what do I do now? I can't pay a debt I don't believe exists, and I certainly don't have $500. Frost was quiet for a moment, and Pearl could almost see the internal struggle on his face. A man clearly accustomed to avoiding entanglements now considering whether to offer further help. "I should get that window boarded up before nightfall," he finally said. It wasn't a declaration of continued assistance, but it wasn't a goodbye either. Pearl accepted it gratefully. "There's lumber out back," she said, "and I have tools." By sunset, Frost had repaired the window as best he could with available materials. Pearl insisted on feeding him supper in her small living quarters behind the store, a simple meal of beans and cornbread, but hot and filling. You're handy with tools, she observed as they ate at her small table. Frost shrugged. Worked as a carpenter's apprentice when I was younger, before I took to ranch work. And what takes you through Credence? She asked. Been working up at the Cameron Ranch. Just came for supplies. He hesitated, then added, was planning to head back today. Pearl nodded, understanding the unspoken message. He had a life elsewhere, responsibilities. And yet, he'd stayed to help her. Well, I'm grateful for your intervention, however temporary, she said. Those men might have. She stopped, unwilling to voice her fears. Frost's expression darkened. Men like that are cowards at heart. But this Delaney sounds like trouble. Trouble I'll have to face. Pearl said with more confidence than she felt. I've managed on my own these past weeks. I'll manage this too. Frost studied her, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't have to. The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address. It's getting late, Pearl said, rising to clear their plates. You're welcome to the spare room for the night. It's not much, but it's clean. To her surprise, Frost accepted with a nod. I'll head out at first light. Pearl didn't challenge this assertion, though something told her that Frost Vance's declaration of departure might prove as temporary as the wooden boards covering her broken window. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Pearl rose early, as was her habit, and found Frost already awake, tending to his horse in the small stable behind the store. Coffee's on, she called to him. He nodded in acknowledgement, finishing his task before following her inside. I've been thinking, he said as she handed him a steaming cup. Those men will be back, likely with this Delaney character. I know, Pearl replied, her stomach nodding at the thought. Frost set his cup down, his expression serious. I could stay a few days. Help you get sorted. Pearl blinked in surprise. What about your job at the Cameron Ranch? Seasons between cattle drives. They can spare me a week. He seemed almost embarrassed by his offer. Just until you figure out this Delaney business. Before Pearl could respond, the front door opened, the bell jingling cheerfully at odds with the tension of the moment. She hurried into the main store area to find Sheriff Liam Moore standing there, hat in hand. Morning, Pearl, he said, then nodded to Frost as he appeared behind her. Heard there was some trouble here yesterday. Pearl explained the situation while the sheriff listened, occasionally making notes in a small book. Delaney, he said thoughtfully when she finished. He's got influence beyond Boulder these days. Been expanding his operations. He looked at Frost. Mighty fortunate Mrs. Wilson had a friend visiting when those men showed up. Mr. Vance was just a customer, Pearl clarified. He intervened when those men became threatening. The sheriff raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on this. Instead, he said, I'll send a telegraph to Boulder, make some inquiries about this alleged debt. But Pearl, if Delaney himself comes. He hesitated. What aren't you saying, Sheriff? Frost asked, his voice carrying an edge. Moore sighed. Delaney's got friends in high places. Judges, politicians. He operates within the law, technically speaking. If he has documentation of a debt, there might not be much I can do. So she's just supposed to pay money she doesn't owe? Frost demanded. I'm saying tread carefully, Moore replied, replacing his hat. I'll do what I can, but in the meantime, might be good to have a friend around. He gave Frost a pointed look before departing. When the door closed behind him, Pearl turned to Frost, her expression resolute. You don't have to stay. This isn't your problem. Maybe not, he agreed. But I'm making it mine for now. He hesitated, then added, I've spent most of my life avoiding other people's troubles. Maybe it's time I stopped running. The admission seemed to cost him something, as though he was sharing a piece of himself he usually kept hidden. Pearl found herself wondering what experiences had taught this young man to keep the world at arm's length. Well then, she said, straightening her apron. If you're staying, I'd best put you to work. Store opens in 30 minutes. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. Yes, ma'am. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Frost proved surprisingly adept at running a store, his quiet manner putting customers at ease despite his imposing presence. He repaired shelving, organized stock, and kept a watchful eye on everyone who entered the establishment. At night, they shared simple meals and gradually, Pearl began to learn more about the enigmatic man who had unexpectedly inserted himself into her life. You never mentioned family, she observed on the third evening as they sat by the small stove in her living quarters. Frost's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Not much to tell. Father died when I was 16. Mother passed before that. I'm sorry, Pearl said softly. My parents are still in Missouri. They wanted me to return east after Thomas died. But, she gestured around her. This place was his dream. Seems wrong to abandon it. What was your dream? Frost asked. The question caught Pearl off guard. I'm not sure anyone's ever asked me that before. She considered for a moment. I suppose I wanted what most girls are taught to want. A husband, children, a home. She smiled sadly. Got part of it, at least for a while. You're young, Frost said. Plenty of time for the rest. Pearl looked into the flames flickering in the stove. Perhaps. Though out here, a woman alone has limited options. Frost was quiet for so long that Pearl thought he might not respond. Finally, he said, the frontier doesn't make much room for dreams. Just survival. Is that all you want? She asked. Just to survive? His blue eyes met hers, and something vulnerable flickered in them. It's all I've allowed myself to want. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Pearl felt an unexpected connection forming. Two people carrying different wounds, but sharing a similar loneliness. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the store's front door. Frost was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Stay here, he instructed, moving silently through to the store. Pearl ignored the directive, following behind him with her own small revolver in hand. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Moore standing outside. Frost relaxed slightly and opened the door. Sorry to disturb you folks, Moore said, stepping inside and removing his hat. But I've got news from Boulder. Pearl steeled herself. About Delaney? The sheriff nodded grimly. Seems your husband did sign some papers. Took a loan from Delaney's bank to finish building this store. $300. Pearl felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. That's impossible. We saved for years to build this place. Costs run higher than expected sometimes, Moore said gently. Lumber prices went up last year with all the building along the railroad. And the extra 200? Frost asked, his voice hard. Interest and penalties, Moore sighed. It's all legal, on paper at least. Delaney's coming himself tomorrow to collect. Thought you should know. After the sheriff left, Pearl sat heavily in a chair, her mind racing. I don't have that kind of money. Everything I've made has gone back into inventory and paying suppliers. Frost paced the length of the store, his expression thunderous. There has to be something we can do. We? Pearl looked up at him, struck by his use of the word. He stopped pacing, his eyes meeting hers. Yes, we. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Something shifted between them in that moment. A recognition that whatever had brought them together was more than chance or circumstance. I have about 200 saved, Frost continued. From my work at the ranch. Pearl shook her head vehemently. I can't take your money. It's not taking if I'm offering, he insisted. And it's just a loan. You can pay me back when business picks up. That still leaves 300, Pearl pointed out. And I won't mortgage my future to a man like Delaney. Frost was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. What if we convinced him the store isn't worth the trouble? That there's more value in settling for what we can offer now? How would we do that? A slow smile spread across Frost's face, the first genuine smile Pearl had seen from him. By changing the terms of negotiation. The next morning, Pearl opened the store at the usual time, though her stomach was in knots. Frost had explained his plan, and while risky, it offered their best chance of resolving the situation without placing her further in Delaney's debt. The town seemed unusually quiet, word having spread that Harlan Delaney himself was coming to Credence. Few customers ventured into the store, leaving Pearl and Frost alone with their mounting tension. Shortly after noon, 3 riders appeared at the end of the street. The man in the center rode a magnificent black stallion and wore a suit that would have looked more at home in Denver's financial district than the dusty streets of Credence. That'll be Delaney, Frost said, moving to stand beside Pearl behind the counter. Remember, let me do the talking at first. Pearl nodded, her throat too dry for speech. She watched as the 3 men dismounted and approached the store, Delaney's confident stride marking him clearly as a man accustomed to getting his way. The bell jingled cheerfully as they entered. Delaney removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. Mrs. Wilson, he said, his voice cultured and smooth. A pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Harlan Delaney. Pearl inclined her head slightly, but didn't offer her hand. Delaney's attention shifted to Frost. And you must be the gentleman who discouraged my associates the other day. I don't believe I caught your name. Frost Vance, he replied, his posture relaxed but alert. I'm Mrs. Wilson's business partner. This was the first part of their plan, establishing Pearl as something other than a vulnerable widow operating alone. Surprise flickered across Delaney's face. I wasn't aware Thomas Wilson had taken on a partner before his unfortunate passing. Recent arrangement, Frost said coolly. I've invested in the business. Delaney studied him for a moment, clearly reassessing the situation. I see. Well, that doesn't change the matter at hand. Your partnership owes me $500. I have the documentation here. He removed papers from an inner pocket. We're prepared to settle the debt, Frost said. $200, paid today. Delaney's eyebrows rose. That's less than half the amount owed. It's all the cash we have on hand, Frost replied. And it's a fair settlement for a loan that was made under questionable circumstances. Questionable? Delaney's voice hardened. The terms were quite clear when Mr. Wilson signed. Perhaps you'd like to take this matter before a judge? Perhaps we would. Pearl spoke up, finding her voice. I'm sure the territorial court would be interested in how your interest rates exceed legal limits. Or how convenient it was that my husband's signature appeared on papers just weeks before a mining accident that several witnesses described as suspicious. It was a bluff. Pearl had no evidence of wrongdoing regarding Thomas's death, but the implication landed precisely as intended. Delaney's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Careful, Mrs. Wilson. Accusations of that nature could be considered slander. Not if they're true, Frost countered. We've been making inquiries of our own. Seems your operation in Boulder has caught the attention of a Pinkerton agent investigating fraud across the territory. This, too, was a calculated bluff, but delivered with such conviction that doubt flickered in Delaney's eyes. $200, Frost continued, and we consider the matter closed. No further claims against this business or Mrs. Wilson. We get documentation stating the debt is paid in full. Delaney considered them both, his calculating gaze moving from Pearl to Frost and back again. Finally, he smiled thinly. You know, I admire initiative. It's rare to find in these small frontier towns. He tapped his fingers on the counter. 200 today, and another 100 due in 6 months. At standard bank rates, no penalties. I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. Pearl and Frost exchanged glances. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than they had hoped for. Agreed, Frost said. Provided we get the new terms in writing today, before any money changes hands. Delaney nodded. My lawyer is at the hotel. I'll have him prepare the documents immediately. After Delaney and his men departed to arrange the paperwork, Pearl released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Do you think he believed us? About the Pinkerton agent? Frost shrugged. Doesn't matter if he believed it. What matters is that he can't be certain it isn't true. Men like Delaney don't take unnecessary risks. Pearl studied him with new appreciation. You've dealt with his kind before. Let's just say I recognize the type, Frost replied, his expression closed. Pearl sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Everyone had parts of themselves they preferred to keep hidden. She of all people understood that. By evening, the matter was settled. The papers were signed, the $200 paid, and Delaney departed with a warning thinly veiled as advice. Choose your partnerships carefully, Mrs. Wilson. The frontier is unforgiving of poor judgment. After he left, Pearl closed the store early and collapsed into a chair, emotional exhaustion washing over her. We did it, she said, looking up at Frost with wonder. I can't believe he accepted. Men like Delaney calculate risk and reward, Frost said, leaning against the counter. We made pursuing the full amount too risky for the potential reward. Pearl shook her head. I don't know how to thank you. You gave up your savings for me, a stranger. Frost looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. You're not exactly a stranger anymore. The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Over the past few days, they had indeed become something more than strangers, perhaps not yet friends, but traveling steadily in that direction. Will you stay? Pearl asked before she could stop herself. Not forever, just until we've paid off the rest of the debt. The store needs a partner, and you're good with the customers, even if you don't think you are. Frost looked genuinely startled by the suggestion. I'm not a shopkeeper, Pearl. I'm a ranch hand. That's all I've been for years now. You're more than that, she insisted. I've seen how you handle the books, how you talk to people. You're smart, capable. Why go back to sleeping in bunkhouses when you could build something here? The question seemed to strike at something deep within him. Frost turned away, moving toward the window to look out at the darkening street. The last time I tried to build something, he said quietly, it ended badly. Pearl approached him cautiously. What happened? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as though the words were coming from someplace far away. I was engaged once. For years ago, down in New Mexico territory. Her father owned a small ranch where I worked. We were going to marry that spring. He paused. Apache raid took her and her family while I was in town getting supplies. By the time I got back, there was nothing left but ashes. Pearl's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Frost. I'm so sorry. After that, I figured it was better not to put down roots. Not to care too much. He turned to face her, his expression raw with long-buried grief. The frontier takes everything eventually. Better not to have anything to lose. In that moment, Pearl understood the man before her with perfect clarity. The isolation, the careful distance he maintained, all armor against further loss. I understand grief, she said softly. When Thomas died, I thought I might die too, from the sheer weight of it. But we don't honor those we've lost by refusing to live, Frost. Is that what you think I'm doing? Not living. I think you're surviving, she said gently. There's a difference. The words hung between them, challenging and true. Frost didn't respond immediately, but something shifted in his expression, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. I'll stay through the summer, he finally said. Help you get the business on solid footing. After that, we'll see. It wasn't a promise of forever, but for Pearl, it was enough for now. One step at a time, she thought. For both of us. The summer months passed in a blur of activity. With Frost's help, the general store flourished. His practical knowledge of ranching needs meant they stocked exactly what the local cattlemen required. Pearl's warm manner and fair pricing brought in families from outlying homesteads. Together, they created something neither could have managed alone. They worked side by side during the days and spent evenings on the small porch behind the store, watching fireflies rise from the grass as they talked about everything and nothing. Gradually, Frost's reticence gave way to a quiet openness. He spoke more of his past, his childhood in Missouri, his years of drifting from ranch to ranch after the tragedy in New Mexico. Pearl shared her own stories, her strict upbringing, her dreams of adventure that had led her to accept Thomas Wilson's proposal and journey west. By mid-July, they had saved enough to pay off the remaining debt to Delaney early. The day they sent the payment, they celebrated with a special dinner and a bottle of wine Pearl had been saving for an important occasion. To freedom from debt, Frost said, raising his glass. And to new beginnings, Pearl added, her eyes meeting his across the table. Something had been growing between them, unspoken but undeniable. Pearl saw it in the way Frost's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, felt it in the careful distance he maintained even as they grew closer emotionally. Summer's almost over, she said after a moment of comfortable silence. Have you decided what you'll do when fall comes? Frost set down his glass, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about that. And? Pearl prompted when he didn't continue. And I'm not sure the store needs a partner anymore. You've proven you can run it successfully on your own. Pearl felt her heart sink. Is that what you want? To leave? What I want? Frost began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. What I want isn't always what's best. Shouldn't I have some say in what's best for me? Pearl asked, her voice quiet but firm. Frost looked at her then, truly looked at her, with all the barriers down. Pearl, you deserve someone whole, not someone still carrying ghosts. We all carry ghosts, she replied. I have mine, you have yours. The question is whether we want to carry them alone. Before he could respond, a frantic pounding on the front door of the store interrupted them. Frost was on his feet instantly, hand going to his revolver. Stay here, he instructed, moving quickly through to the main store. Pearl, as always, ignored this directive and followed close behind. Through the window, they could see young Billy Hayes, the telegraph operator's son, his face pale in the lamplight. Frost opened the door. What is it, Billy? Fire, the boy gasped. At the livery stable. Sheriff sent me to fetch everyone who can help. Without hesitation, Frost grabbed his hat. Pearl, stay here where it's safe. Like hell, she retorted, already reaching for her shawl. Those are people's livelihoods burning. I'm coming. The look he gave her was equal parts exasperation and admiration. Without further argument, they hurried toward the column of smoke now visible rising over the rooftops. The scene at the livery stable was chaos. Flames licked up the wooden walls, and panicked horses screamed from within. A bucket line had formed, but the fire was gaining ground faster than they could combat it. The horses, someone shouted. We need to get the horses out. Frost immediately ran toward the burning building, joining several other men who were trying to lead terrified animals to safety. Pearl joined the bucket line, passing water from hand to hand in a desperate attempt to keep the flames from spreading to neighboring buildings. The heat was intense, the smoke choking. Through watering eyes, Pearl kept looking for Frost, her heart in her throat each time he disappeared back into the burning stable. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously as the town fought the blaze. She had just passed another bucket when a sickening crack echoed across the street, the sound of timbers giving way. A portion of the stable roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks skyward and a collective gasp through the crowd. Frost! Pearl screamed, dropping her bucket and running toward the building. Strong arms caught her, holding her back. You can't go in there, Mrs. Wilson. Sheriff Moore shouted over the roar of the flames. Frost is in there, she cried, struggling against his grip. Along with Sam Miller and young Joe Parker, the sheriff said grimly. We don't know if any of them made it out the back. Pearl felt as though her heart might burst from her chest. The possibility that Frost might be gone, trapped beneath burning timber, was unbearable. In that moment of pure terror, she recognized the truth she had been circling for months. She loved him. Completely, irrevocably. Please, she whispered, no longer certain if she was addressing the sheriff or God himself. Please. Long minutes passed as the bucket brigade continued their desperate work. The flames began to recede slightly under their efforts, but no one emerged from the smoldering ruin of the stable. Then, just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, there was movement at the far corner of the building. 3 soot-covered figures emerged from the smoke, leading the last of the horses. Pearl broke free from the sheriff's slackened grip and ran. Frost looked up just in time to see her coming. He handed the reins he was holding to Sam Miller and opened his arms. Pearl crashed into him, her tears cutting tracks through the soot on his shirt. You're alive, she gasped, pulling back to look at him, reassuring herself that he was whole. I'm all right, he said, his voice hoarse from smoke but strong. His hands came up to frame her face. We got out through the back when the roof started to go. Pearl wasn't conscious of making a decision. She simply rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, pouring all her fear and relief and love into the kiss. For a heartbeat, Frost went still with surprise. Then his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer as he returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and very aware they had an audience, Frost kept his arms around her. I thought I'd lost you, Pearl whispered. Something in Frost's expression shifted, as though the last pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. You can't lose me, he said quietly. I'm not going anywhere, Pearl. Not unless you send me away. Never, she replied fiercely. It wasn't the most conventional declaration of love, made as it was in the midst of disaster, covered in soot and smoke. But for 2 people who had known more than their share of tragedy, it was perfect in its raw honesty. The town managed to contain the fire before it spread beyond the stable. In the days that followed, everyone pitched in to help rebuild. The crisis brought the community together in a way Pearl hadn't witnessed before, with families opening their homes to those displaced and sharing whatever resources they had. Frost proved invaluable during the reconstruction, his carpentry skills suddenly in high demand. He worked from dawn until dusk, coming home exhausted but with a new sense of purpose. Home, Pearl noticed, had become the rooms behind the store without either of them quite acknowledging the shift. 3 weeks after the fire, with the new livery stable nearly complete, Frost and Pearl sat on their back porch in what had become their evening ritual. The first hint of autumn crispness tinged the air. I spoke with Reverend Davis today, Frost said, his voice carefully casual. Pearl glanced at him, curious. Oh, about what? About whether he'd be available to perform a wedding next month. Frost turned to face her fully, his expression nervous but determined. If you'd be amenable to the idea. Pearl felt her heart skip. Are you asking me to marry you, Frost Vance? He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I'm not good with fancy words, Pearl. But I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day when you stood up to Delaney's men with that little revolver in your hand. He smiled slightly. I never thought I'd find home again after everything that happened. But it's not a place, is it? It's a person. You're my home. Tears welled in Pearl's eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Frost's smile, that rare, transformative expression, bloomed fully. He pulled her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of beginnings rather than endings. They were married on a perfect October morning, with the aspen trees blazing gold against the blue Colorado sky. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the store closing for an unprecedented 2 days as the community celebrated their union. Standing before Reverend Davis, exchanging vows with the man who had ridden into town for grain but stayed for love, Pearl felt a sense of rightness that transcended all the hardships she had endured. Thomas would have approved, she thought. He had always told her that life was for the living. As for Frost, the transformation was remarkable to those who had known him before. The solitary ranch hand who had believed the frontier was no place for love now looked at his bride with unguarded adoration. The walls he had built around his heart had fallen, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, stone by stone, under Pearl's patient care. Mrs. Vance, he whispered that evening as they stood on their porch, watching stars appear in the darkening sky, has a nice sound to it. Pearl leaned against him, content in a way she had never imagined possible after being widowed so young. It does indeed, Mr. Vance. I was thinking, he said, his arms secure around her waist, that with the store doing so well, we might consider expanding. There's that empty lot next door. Pearl looked up at him, delighted by this evidence of his commitment to their shared future. What did you have in mind? A hardware store, maybe, or a proper lumber yard. Credence is growing. Might as well grow with it. Building something that will last, Pearl said softly. Frost nodded, his eyes reflecting the first evening stars. Something that will outlast us both. In that moment, standing on the threshold of their life together, Pearl understood that the frontier wasn't just about survival after all. It was about finding the courage to build something meaningful in the face of uncertainty. It was about choosing love over fear, connection over isolation. And as Frost's lips found hers in the gathering darkness, Pearl knew they had both made that choice. Whatever hardships lay ahead, and the frontier ensured there would be many, they would face them together, no longer alone in a vast and unforgiving land, but bound by a love strong enough to tame even the wildest territory of the human heart.